Is there any genetic proof that we are alien? Because I've been seeing that there is a little bit starting to come out all over the place. Like Colleen actually sent an email out with one talking about that. And
well, a lot of geneticists have been discovering that there are aspects of us. Originally, when Watson and Crick, basically back in the 1950s, when they got their Nobel Prize for discovering the RNA DNA and how it creates the genetic aspects of us, how it makes us who we are, they found a huge pile of stuff in the middle, and they just called it detritus. They thought it was the remnants of our former evolution from using the model that most people in biology use, and which is the Darwin model, that we went from being a single-celled animal all the way up on this planet to being human. And so they saw that must be the remnants, which is something you observe when you look at a fetus as it's being developed. It goes from a very primitive-looking thing to a human. And in between it has all kinds of things, frills, gills, and all kinds of things like that. So they were thinking that that was the same basic analogy. They also discovered that the majority of genetic materials in the nucleus of our cell is dormant. So they thought that was further proof of the whole concept they came up with, that it was evolutionary detritus. In other words, just stuff that had been left over from former times when it was used, when we were more quote-unquote primitive. But actually what science has been discovering over the last 25 years is just the opposite. We actually have stuff within us in our genetics that is totally different. And they've also discovered that genes work in sequence. So there's genes that have been turned off and genes that have been turned on. And we have actually the worst of it all. So they discovered that what's happening over the last 10 years, especially in the last 5 years, in a lot of laboratories, they've been discovering that this stuff that they thought was dead, this stuff in the middle of our helix, which is the third strand, is actually coming alive. It was starting to interact with the various ladders of the RNA DNA. It was starting to actually communicate. And this process of communicating one piece of DNA to another is simply called encoding. So what happened was, suddenly it was coming alive, the so-called junk DNA, and it was busily encoding with the so-called regular RNA DNA. And what they began discovering is that it seems like this is a library for higher consciousness. And as people become more aware and more conscious, they discover that more and more of this genetic stuff is coming online. They also have, recently in the last 3 to 5 years, come up with something called epigenetics, which simply means above genetics. And they've discovered that emotions and what we might call the conscious self is actually through whatever is experienced in past lives, passed on through the passing on of our genetics, or also in present times, whatever we encounter that's a stress situation, whether it's good or bad, it's still a stress situation. And so as a result, we have changed around our sequencing. So what is now believed is that as this encoding happens and we begin to ascend, this encoding will now change the sequencing and our basic epigenetics will change. And it seems like epigenetics is tied into things like aging, diseases, lifespan, stuff like that. So what we are discovering is that we are actually above. We're all really an epigenetic being that is basically having a 3D reality that really should be a higher consciousness being, and that as this stuff, this genetic material comes online, we are becoming more and more aware of things that we were usually not aware of, because it meant you had to have more of an awareness in terms of consciousness than before. And consciousness is really more than just awareness. It's the organization of that awareness so that it's able to be combined with the awareness not only of your physical self, but the awareness of your spiritual self. So that is really what is happening to us right now. That's why I am calling this whole thing our movement from limited consciousness, which simply means the limited abilities that we have to move around with this spiritual and physical consciousness, moving toward full consciousness, which means a full aspect of all the potentials that we have being manifested. So we become a fully potentialized conscious being, which they have basically, and they being the Syrians that I grew up with, and also the people who are dealing with what I do right now, explaining various aspects of what's going on in the world and what's going on with our movement toward being full consciousness, they basically call us either physical angels or galactic beings. So, or else we might call them galactic humans, because we're humans. So that's basically what I have been taught and what I am teaching, because I've had experiences with it, and I've also seen, as I said, a lot of scientific stuff. And also they're discovering that there's a lot of uniquenesses with us, which makes us a very different kind of being. So we are not really, from all that I can see and all that I've heard and the evidence that I've said, that we are really beings evolved on this planet. We are beings that evolved from another place and came here and then went down in consciousness. And, of course, a large part of that is all about Atlantis and Lemuria, and that's why a lot of that stuff, any material dealing with it whatsoever, is very difficult to get real scientific answers on, because there's a giant suppression on how all of that is to be put together as part of actual geological and biological evidence for the history of our planet and the history of ourselves.